Hey, what's going on, everybody? Timothy here with Mana Rocks, continuing our archetype breakdown for Core Set 2021. This is part 3, so if you haven't checked out the other videos yet, where we've gone over a lot of the black archetypes and, whatever else we went over in those videos, check those out. Again, just to give you a snapshot of what we're doing here is we're looking at the 2-color pairs for limited, mainly for draft, but they also apply to sealed, and we're kind of breaking down the key uncommons for them, the payoff cards, the enablers, and of course the rares that get a little bit of a bump when they're in that archetype. Not to say that they have to be played in those archetypes, but they get a little bit better when they fit in a certain archetype. So that's the game plan today. We're going to be looking at white-green and black-green, which is going to be a +1/+1 counter deck and a Morbid or Death Matters deck. So let's go ahead and jump in with white-green right off the bat. Again, white-green is shifted into +1/+1 counter territory here, which is something we often see in like blue-green or even black-green before. So it's kind of interesting to have it focused in white-green. And white-green's uncommon should look a little bit familiar. It's not a reprint, but the effect is not necessarily new. That uncommon is Conclave Mentor. Green, white for a 2/2. It's an uncommon Centaur Cleric, so 2 mana 2/2, and it has the Hardened Scales ability, or the Wind-In Constrictor ability if you're used to that. If one or more +1 counters would be put on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1 counters on that creature instead. So it adds an additional counter anytime you would put a +1/+1 counter. Note, this does not double if you're not used to these sorts of effects. It's always +1. So if I give Conclave Mentor an effect that puts 3 +1/+1 counters on it, it's going to get 4 instead, not 6. Mentor has an extra ability. When it dies, gain life equal to its power. And, that's a nice little upside to have on this card. But honestly, if you're excited about this card, if you're playing this card, it's because it adds additional counters. And as we'll see in this little section, there are quite a few ways in this set to add counters. So getting to add additional counters without paying an actual cost, since this is just a bear, a 2 mana 2/2, is pretty nice, and I think Conclave Mentor will definitely pull its weight in green-white. It's not really a card that you're looking to splash in other colors, since most of the +1/+1 counter stuff is focused in green and white, which I like. I like when your gold uncommon is very specific to its own guild, and that should be the case here with Conclave Mentor. So looking at some of the rares, the first one we want to mention here is Ket. This is our new white planeswalker. This one is 1 white for a 3 loyalty mythic walker. And the +1 ability is pretty simple. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and it gains indestructible until end of turn. So just a nice little way to plus a planeswalker and throw around some +1/+1 counters. Obviously, Dream Scenario is on the screen right now. Turn 2 Conclave Mentor, turn 3 Ket, and with a Conclave Mentor on board, you'll be putting 2 +1/+1 counters on whatever you target with the +1 ability. Ket's -2 says whenever one or more non-token creatures attack this turn, create that many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attack in. This is actually a very powerful effect for the late game. Even in the early game, if you go 2-drop into turn 3 Ket and attack with the -2 ability, you're going to get an extra token. But there are some board states where you'll have 4 or 5 creatures that can attack. Ket will come down in -2, and you'll just get an additional 5 tokens attack in, which is really nice for a 3 mana planeswalker. I do believe you'll be plussing more often than not, but once you plus into territory where you're able to attack with 1 big creature, you can start -2ing to get some extra board presence. He has an emblem as well. As I've mentioned in other videos, I don't put a lot of stock into a planeswalker's emblem, since it often requires you to just be untouched and unscathed for a certain number of turns. But Basri has an emblem nonetheless. -6, get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So again, not a planeswalker ultimate that just immediately wins the game, but with enough time, it is inevitability. If you manage to -6 Ket, you can just sit around and do nothing until your board state is untenable and your opponent can't deal with it anymore. But the real power is in the +1 and -2, which is a nice little array of abilities. Get to grow singular threats into bigger threats while also using the -2 to potentially build the board out. Seems pretty nice, and yes, you'll play this in any white deck, but it is tailor-made for the white-green +1/+1 counter deck. Boss Tree's Lieutenant, another busted rare, is 3 and a white for a 3/4. It's a rare human knight, and it has Vigilance and Protection from Multicolored. Protection from Multicolored's a nice bonus, but there's only about 12, 13 multicolor cards in the entire set, and none of them are common or below, so don't expect Protection from Multicolored to be super relevant, just an extra little bonus for maybe 10% of games you play it in. 4 mana, 3/4 Vigilance is just fine as well, and Boss Tree's Lieutenant has a double upside here. It says, first off, when Boss Tree's Lieutenant enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. That can be itself, so this can come down as a 4/5, or you can just pump up one of your other creatures. Just nice to be able to throw around an additional counter on a creature that already has pretty good stats. It also says when Boss Tree's Lieutenant or another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, create a 2/2 White Knight creature token with Vigilance. That is a huge payoff for having +1/+1 counters across the board, just making it so that your opponent, A, has to deal with your threat because they have +1 counters on them. They're likely pretty large or something that your opponent's going to have to deal with eventually. And B, paying you off when those creatures die, right? Maybe you're even sacrificing your own creatures and just replacing them with 2/2 Vigilant Knights. Seems pretty strong to me. I think play pattern, a lot of times you'll just put the counter on this itself to guarantee that you have a giant creature on board, and also to make it a threat that your opponent has to answer that will also replace itself with a 2/2. So I like Boss Tree's Lieutenant. This should be a no-brainer first pick card in any draft, and highly splashable in other decks, especially if those decks happen to have +1/+1 counters in other colors. Scavenging Ooze is back, and most people will probably know what this does, but we'll read it anyway. 1 and a green for a 2/2. It is a rare ooze, and for a single green mana, you can exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you put a +1/+1 counter on the ooze, and you gain 1 life. This should be a card that goes in every single green deck, whether you care about graveyard synergies or eating your opponent's graveyard, or +1/+1 counters, it doesn't matter. Scavenging Ooze is just a great card for a bear, right? A bear with massive upside, and it can even mess up some of your opponent's strategies by eating creatures or spells out of their graveyard. So it has an extra little bonus there. I don't know that this is necessarily a better first pick than some of the top tier removal or top tier cards in the set at uncommon, but it is a great card and you'll be happy to have it regardless of whether you have +1/+1 counter synergy. Animal Sanctuary, also a card I just wanted to briefly mention because it can throw around +1/+1 counters, but if you've seen this card, it's a little bit specific. It's a colorless land, it just taps for colorless, and for 2 mana you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, but that creature has to be either a bird, a cat, a dog, a goat, an ox, or a snake. Just a completely wide array of creatures. Now, there are plenty of cats and dogs in this set. I don't know off the top of my head if there are any goats or oxen or snakes. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's at least one of each for that to be included on this card. But there are birds, cats, and dogs, and if you happen to be white-green and you happen to have a couple of those creatures and you happen to pick up an Animal Sanctuary, which is not a card that people will be picking up early in the draft, maybe you get it like 5th, 6th pick or something like that, then sure, you can consider putting it in your deck, and it'll be just fine if you have a couple targets for it. All right, that brings us to our payoffs and our enablers. We're going to list a lot of cards here that either deal with +1/+1 counters or give +1/+1 counters. And the nice little thing is a lot of the payoff cards that deal with creatures that already have +1/+1 counters also grant +1/+1 counters. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these. The first one is Boss Tree's Solidarity. 1 and a white for an uncommon sorcery. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Normally, this sort of effect would be kind of meh, right? And honestly, I don't think it's ever really been this cheap before. But if you get at least 2 counters on a creature, you have 2 creatures on board and you cast this, and you have some sort of benefit for having +1/+1 counters on your creatures, this card's not bad. The upside is obviously much, much higher, where you might have 4+ creatures on board, and this is 2 mana to just distribute an extra 4 or 5 power on board, a lot of which has haste because those creatures are likely going to be able to attack right away. Of course, we want to temper that by saying that sometimes this is a dead card. If you have no creatures on board and you desperately need to top deck a creature, you might draw this instead. So you can kind of see high ceilings, very, very low floors. For the most part, I think you should be able to expect to get multiple counters out of this card, and that makes it quite good. Although I'm looking at it a little bit more if I have other things that care about +1/+1 counters, like the Conclave uncommon that we saw. Things of that nature, right? Fine card. It is uncommon for a reason, and I think it's going to play out quite well. Light of Promise we mentioned in the black-white life gain video. I'll just go over it quickly and we'll dismiss it because it's not really a card you want here. It's just something I wanted to mention because it does put +1/+1 counters. This is the 3-mana aura that says whenever you gain life, put that much +1/+1 counters on a creature, on the creature that's enchanted. It's just not worth it here. You might have a couple ways to gain life if you're green-white, but you're probably not full in on it. Save this card for black-white, and even then I don't think you should be playing it in that deck. Kyrion Dryad is back at uncommon. I believe formerly this card has always been a rare. Probably uncommon is decent because the card's not that insane. It's 1 and a green for a 1/1 uncommon Dryad, and it says whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, put a +1/+1 counter on Kyrion Dryad. So green spells don't grow this unless they're gold. Like a green-white spell, for example, will in fact trigger Kyrion Dryad. But for the most part, you want to play this in a deck that's heavy on other colors. It's weird. It gets its own +1/+1 counters. It varies in power level depending on when it gets played. If you have a turn 2 Kyrion Dryad, it's pretty good and quite strong. If you have a turn 5 or 6 Kyrion Dryad, it loses a lot of its weight. So uncommon seems decent for it. Not a creature you're clamoring for, but also not a creature that other people should be clamoring for. Kyrion Dryad, just fine. You'll play it in this deck. Basri's Acolyte is a very powerful common. It's 2 white for a common 2/3 cat cleric with lifelink. So 4 mana 2/3 lifelink, that's just fine. It's not exceptional, but it does have an exceptional ability. It says when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures you control. Note that it cannot put any +1/+1 counters on itself, and it can only put a single +1 counter on each creature that it targets. You cannot put 2 counters on the same creature. If you get the full value out of it, you're getting 4 power, 5 toughness, some of which has a lifelink spread across 3 bodies. That's extremely powerful. Even if you only get 1 counter on another creature, this is quite good. It's perfectly acceptable to go 3-drop into Basri's Acolyte with no other board presence. But the fact that sometimes you can get 2 additional counters on board as well as a 2/3 lifelink and body means that this card is going to be extremely strong while also fueling your +1 counters energies. Hunter's Edge is a new take on Hunt the Weak. It's 3 and a green for a common sorcery, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control, so it bites another creature rather than fighting, right? The other creature does not hit it back, making it more like a rabid bite type effect than an actual prey upon type effect. And, you know, Hunt the Weak was always pretty decent, if not good, in the formats that it's been in, and this is just a strict upgrade to Hunt the Weak. So Hunter's Edge, quite good, gives you that +1/+1 counter, and gives green a removal spell, so a pretty good shoe-in card for this archetype. Feat of Resistance is back from Khans of Tarkir. Remember this card in Khans of Tarkir? I believe, if I'm correct, that this was possibly just the best white common in the entire set, and I expect it to be really strong here because, again, the +1/+1 counter matters for some of these archetypes. Feat of Resistance, for those who don't know, is kind of a riff on God's Willin'. It's 1 and a white. For an instant, it's a common, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then it gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. So a lot of times this card just leads to blowouts in combat, or you blank a removal spell, and your creature comes out stronger on the other end. I'm a big fan of cheap protection abilities, and when they leave something behind, I like them a bit more. So Feat of Resistance definitely has my thumb of approval for this set. I expect it to be quite strong. Makeshift Battalion is back from War of the Spark, perhaps? Maybe this was a different Ravnica set, but it's 2 and a white, 3/2, common human soldier. When it and at least 2 other creatures attack, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This card was not exceptional in the format that it was printed in, if I recall correctly, but it was serviceable, right? 3 mana, 3/2 is not something you're excited about, but it can pick up counters here and there. It can become an actual threat, and your opponent will have to deal with it eventually. It's not a great card, but it's one that your opponent can't just ignore, and it might matter that it can pick up a +1/+1 counter here and there. Sabertooth Mauler, a card that we'll see again in the second half of this video. 3 and a green for a 3/3 common cat creature. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on the Sabertooth Mauler and untap it. Obviously, this one doesn't just generically gift you +1/+1 counters. You have to do a little bit of work, but it doesn't matter whether your creatures are dying or whether your opponent's creatures are dying. So if you're in a type of deck that can kill your opponent's creature and make this a little bit bigger, then sure, you'll take it. I think this card's going to be just fine. Nothing exceptional, but also nothing too bad either. Truffle Snout, worth talking about here. Truffle Snout is our new upgraded Brindle Shoat, Rip Brindle Shoat. Anyway, Truffle Snout, 2 and a green for a 2/2 common boar, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. Put a +1/+1 counter on Truffle Snout or gain 4 life. Kind of nice to note here that this will happen to trigger any of your other gain 3 payoffs that we've talked about, things like the Silver Smoke Ghoul, or perhaps the 4-mana return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Truffle Snout is actually an off-color way to trigger some of those life gain synergies that we talked about in previous videos, but for the purposes of this archetype, this will often be a 3-mana 3/3 that happens to be holding a +1/+1 counter for whatever that might matter. Pride Malkin is one of our first payoff cards that is also an enabler. It helps put +1/+1 counters on board, but also gives you something for putting +1/+1 counters on board. Pride Malkin is 2 and a green for a 2/1 common cat, 3-mana 2/1, not very good, but it enters the battlefield and you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. That doesn't have to be the Pride Malkin, but as early as like turn 3, maybe turn 4, a lot of times you will just be putting this counter on the cat itself to make it a 3-mana 3/2, very similar to Truffle Snout, but with a little bit of upside. It says each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has trample. So we've seen this effect before, but on much more expensive creatures, it's kind of nice to have this on a common. If you can get +1/+1 counters on big creatures, that is a relevant ability, and this by itself is a 3-mana 3/2 trample with some +1/+1 counter synergy going on. So I like this card. I think it'll play out just fine, even if you're not fully in the green-white archetype here, but if you are, it gets a lot better. Invigorating Surge is 2 and a green for an uncommon instant. It puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and then you double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature. So this is going to vary from being +2/+2 permanently to something like +6/+6 or +8/+8. It's hard for this card to be too bad. 3 mana to put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature is an expensive combat trick, but a good one if it works, because the creature will come out of combat with higher power and toughness. Think something like a Feral Invocation from previous core sets, the 3 mana flash enchantment that gives the enchanted creature +2/+2. When that works and your creature survives, you have a huge threat on board. Invigorating Surge is always going to do at least that, but sometimes will do more if the creature already had +1/+1 counters on it, right? If you target something with no counters on it, this gives +2/+2. But if you target something that has, let's just say, a single counter on it, then this is essentially given +3/+3. It'll put an additional counter, and then it'll double it up to 4, so your creature will have 4 +1/+1 counters on it. This seems like a pretty strong combat trick. I would evaluate it most of the time as just a +2/+2 permanent buff, but sometimes it'll be a little bit better, and in green-white, it'll be at its best. Wildwood Scourge is a strictly better Ivy Elemental, since we just got done playing with that one in Ikoria. It is X green for a 0/0 that enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counter, so exactly Ivy Elemental. And then it has a little bit of extra text. Whenever 1 or more +1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature you control, put a +1/+1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. The non-Hydra thing's a little bit weird, but I assume that's there so that 2 copies of this just don't infinitely trigger one another. A little strange, but it makes sense. This card's good, right? Ivy Elemental's fine. It wasn't exceptional. It hasn't been exceptional in years, but it's fine. You would play it as a curve filler, and Wildwood Scourge is just a tiny bit better than that. If you're in a deck that cares about +1 counters, you'll play this. This is a core set too. Things are maybe a tiny little bit less about synergy and more about just board presence. Wildwood Scourge is going to give you some board presence, and it happens to just pick up extra counters along the way too. So in a dedicated deck with +1 counters, I expect Wildwood Scourge to be a decent amount better than the typical Ivy Elemental. Tempered Veteran. This is a unique one because I'm not sure whether it's just fantastic or not good enough. You can let me know how you feel about this card. It's 1 and a white for a 1/2 uncommon human knight. Obviously, 2 mana 1/2 is not very good. It says for white mana, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that already has a +1 counter on it. Okay, so this doesn't get going by itself right away. It is very cheap, and being able to use that ability is nice. Just tap in 1 mana to put a +1 counter on something is way stronger than it seems. It makes things like attacking and blocking extremely difficult, but the obvious problem here is that you have to already have +1 counters on your creatures in order to use that ability. It has a little bit of a twist though, because for 4 white, for 6 mana you can tap it, and you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That's obviously a huge late game ability, and that is powerful. Once you get that first activation and you put a counter on, you can just switch to using the first ability. But I wouldn't underestimate this card, because you don't necessarily have to use the 6 mana ability to start using the first mana ability if you have other cards in your deck that either come with +1 counters on them or can grant +1 counters, which we've seen. I've been talking about it for almost 20 minutes now. There are a bunch of these, right? If you play something like a Wildwood Scourge or a Truffle Snout or a Pride Malkin, these cards already come with their own +1 counters attached to them, and then you can use Tempered Veteran to just start pumping them up even higher. In the case of the Pride Malkin, that thing has Trample, and other creatures have Trample. So I think this card is going to be quite good. It's not a very impressive 2-drop, but it is an impressive late game or even middle to late game ability if you have other ways to put +1 counters on it. Cool thing about it is other decks don't want this card. I can't imagine there's any other deck outside of green-white that's going to want this card. So look to wheel this if you're in green-white, and pick up your +1 counter stuff before picking this card up. I think other decks shouldn't be interested in this card. Alright, enough about +1/+1 counters. I can stop saying that now, right? Let's go ahead and move on to Black-Green Morbid. And Morbid is just shorthand here for saying that it's an archetype that cares about creatures dying. We're going to see a bunch of triggers that will trigger when creatures die, or will check on end step or combat or upkeep to see if a creature has died that turn. Starting off with our uncommon, which is quite good. It's Twin Blade Assassins. 3 black-green for a 5/4. Uncommon, Elf Assassin. 5 mana 5/4 is perfectly serviceable. That, I believe, passes the vanilla test. And it has an actually pretty powerful end step ability. It says, at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, draw a card. That's really good. Note that it's only on your end step, so if your opponent is crashing in on their turn and you're blocking, make sure you just realize you won't be drawing a card on their end step if a creature died. So you want to make sure creatures are dying. That means instant speed removal. You might just use it at sorcery speed to make sure you get a trigger off of this. But every removal spell you play now draws a card, which makes Twin Blade Assassins a fantastic card. I do expect this to be the type of card that other decks will be willing to splash if they can, because this is just a huge ability. If you ever draw a single card off of this, it's perfectly great. Whatever perfectly great means. Perfectly serviceable is what I meant as just a vanilla 5/4, but this actually becomes great when you draw extra cards off of it. As far as the rares, yeah, look, any creature that's going to come down and kill your opponent's creatures is great, but Massacre Worm, being the super bomb it already is even better in an archetype that cares about your opponent's creatures dying, where you're going to build your deck to make sure you have removal to take your opponent's creatures out. Look, Black-Green is not pushing the envelope. It's not making you draft anything you wouldn't already be drafting. Like, you're going to take your removal spells, you're going to try and trade off with your opponent's creatures, but it actually rewards you for doing that. And Massacre Worm, we all know this card. It is absolutely busted. It kills creatures on its own, but then it pays you off for just killing your opponent's creatures while it's on the board, and it will wrap up most games it's involved in. Liliana's Standard Bearer we mentioned, I believe, in the first video with a black-red sacrifice deck, but just to read it again for the new people, it's 2 and a black for a 3/1 flash zombie knight. It's a rare. And when it enters the battlefield, draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures that died under your control this turn. So this one doesn't just care about creatures dying, it cares about how many of your creatures died, and it will draw you cards equal to that number, which is quite powerful on an already reasonable body. 3 mana 3/1 flash is something I would play basically every single deck. This draws you a couple extra cards if you time it right. A perfect fit for a deck that cares about killing creatures. Alright, so that's it for the rares. Obviously, if you have powerful rares, play them, right? They're going to be good. Let's look at the enablers. Let's look at the payoff cards. There's a lot of cards in this set that just care about creatures dying. We'll go and take a look at them. So starting off with Liliana's Steward, I did just want to mention a couple of the cards that can sacrifice themselves, since this will fit the goal of making sure a creature died that turn. Not that some of these cards are exceptional, but sometimes you'll play these just to make sure your other cards are triggering. Liliana's Steward is a 1 black mana 1/2 for a common. You can tap it at sorcery speed to make target opponent discard a card. Nothing great. This isn't exceptionally better than like a burglar rat or anything along those lines. It's a little bit worse than just like a targeted discard spell where you get to pick a card, but it's fine. It's a body that can put itself in the graveyard. If you're playing this sort of deck, you play Liliana's Steward on turn 1. Try holding on to it until you have something that'll trigger, and you'll get the benefit off of that, as well as making your opponent discard a card. Portcullis Vine is kind of the opposite. 1 green mana for a 0/3 defender. You can pay 2 mana and tap it to sacrifice any creature with defender to draw a card. It doesn't necessarily have to sacrifice itself, but you won't often have too many other defenders in your deck. Fine, right? A creature that can sacrifice itself, fulfill the requirement of having a creature die that turn, and just replace itself with a card. And we've spoke about Silver Smoke Ghoul a couple times now as just a life gain payoff, but it's here too because it is a creature that can sacrifice itself to draw a card and can even come back if you have a couple life gain synergies in your deck to do it again and trigger your abilities multiple times. As far as actual payoffs go, we just spoke about Sabertooth Mauler in the green-white section. This was the 4-mana 3/3 that gets a +1 counter and untaps at your end step if a creature died this turn. It's fine. It doesn't have any abilities. It doesn't gain trample or anything like that, but it does get progressively bigger throughout the course of a game. And it starts off in a fine place. If you can kill a creature and then play the second main, maybe your opponent wasn't expecting it and they traded off in combat, then Sabertooth Mauler is essentially going to come down as a 4/4 that turn, which is quite good. Canopy Stalker we spoke about as well, although very briefly in the red-green video. This is 3 and a green for a 4/2 uncommon cat, another cat. It must be blocked available, and when it dies, you gain 1 life for each creature that died this turn. So that's not just your creatures, that's any creature that died this turn is going to give you a life. And honestly, if this creature attacks, it's probably going to die because your opponent is forced to block it. We've played with cards like this before. They're never really that good with this stat line. I don't think the death trigger is really that much more. If this just said when it dies, gain 2 life, then sure, that would be okay. But this is more filler card than anything. Honestly, if I have cards in my deck that care about dying and care about 4-power creatures, I'm a little more likely to want this, but I don't think it's an exceptional creature. Liliana's Devotee, another card we've spoken about before. 3 mana, 2/3, gives all of your zombies +1/+0, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1 and a black. If you do, create a 2/2 zombie creature token. We talked about this in red-black because it is a way to continuously get creatures on board which you can sacrifice for value. The same is true here. It is a way to produce an engine to make sure creatures are constantly dying. The benefit's a little bit different here because you're not sacrificing to other effects, but you are fueling your cards like Sabertooth Mauler and some of the other cards we'll see here. So I do expect Liliana's Devotee to be a high pick for basically any black deck. Don't think you'll wheel this one, but if you have it in your deck, it's going to make your morbid triggers a lot better or a lot more consistent. Caged Zombie is an interesting one. 2 and a black for a 2/3 common zombie. For 1 and a black, you can tap it and each opponent loses 2 life, but you can activate that ability only if a creature has died this turn. That's a good ability. If you ignored the condition, just 2 mana tap, each opponent loses 2 life is very strong. 2-headed giant, anyone? But even in single player, that's a strong ability, and that can actually win a game on a board state that's not changing much. Obviously, if creatures are constantly dying, then the board state probably is changing a little bit. But with a card like Liliana's Devotee or anything that can produce an engine, this is a nice way to turn that engine into an actual win if attacking isn't going to do it. You can also use this on your opponent's turn if you keep up 2 mana and just trade off in combat. So I like Caged Zombie. I think it's fine, and I do think this card will end games. Malefic Scythe, another card we've mentioned before. 1 in a black for an uncommon equipment that enters the battlefield with a soul counter on it and gets another +1/+1, or rather, gets another soul counter whenever the equipped creature dies. The effect that you get off of that is giving the equipped creature +1/+1 for each soul counter on it, and you can equip for 1 generic mana. Very easy to move around. If creatures are constantly dying and you have an excess of mana, this card can get out of hand. It can make some of your creatures into giant threats, and it really only needs to trigger once before it becomes a powerful equipment. 1 mana to move around a cheap equipment and give a creature +2/+2 is good. Sometimes this card will be better than that, and sometimes it'll be worse. But I'm erring on the side of saying that Malefic Scythe is going to pull its weight in decks that can either sacrifice their own creatures or force combat to happen. Fungal Rebirth, probably the best payoff, perhaps one of the best payoffs for this archetype. 2 and a green for an uncommon instant. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If a creature died this turn, create 2 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens. If you get the Saprolings off of it, this card is extremely powerful. If you don't, this card is very bad. 3 mana to get a permanent back from your graveyard to your hand. Not cutting it in limited these days. You would probably never play that card, but 3 mana for 2 1/1s plus getting a card back from your graveyard is huge. You need to make sure you time this at a time where you are going to get the 1/1s, but it is an instant, so it's not too hard to do this on your opponent's turn. It's not too hard to do this on your own turn if you force it to happen, and I expect this card to be extremely powerful, even though this is not specific to green-black. I think basically any green deck will be happy to have this card. Life Goes On. I had to mention this because it fits in the archetype, but you should not play this card, but it's here. Let's go ahead and talk about it. It's a single green mana. For a common instant, it says you gain 4 life. If a creature died this turn, you gain 8 life instead. You have to be against the most hyper-aggressive deck of all time in order for the life gain to really matter. And yes, there are a couple cards in this set that might care about you gaining a certain amount of life, but this is a green card and it won't often line up with those other cards. But if somehow you have a bunch of the payoffs that care about gaining multiple amounts of life, gaining 3 life per turn, and somehow you ended up in a deck that can maybe splash the white payoffs and play green, then sure, you might play a copy of Life Goes On. But even then, I would advise against even taking this card and putting it in a pool of limited cards. Just stay away from it. It's not worth it unless you are 100% guaranteeing that you're triggering some other ability off of it. And that's it. Taking care of green, black, and green, white. 2 very different strategies, but pretty generic strategies, right? Things that you're used to seeing in a core set. +1/+1 counters and creatures dying. It's pretty obvious to figure out what to do with that, right? Take your removal spells, take the synergy cards, take stuff like that. Should play out like 2 just fine archetypes. And then there's even a little bit of overlap and potential for splashing with other archetypes. So thanks for watching. We've got 4 archetypes left. I believe the next video we'll be talking about blue-white and blue-red. So stay tuned for that. 2 videos left. My name's Timothy with Mana Rocks. Remember to subscribe below for more content like this, or find us on Twitter at MTG_Mana Rocks. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.